In this week's Reverse Diet Update, we're going to talk about creating long-term strategies for cutting and building, and we're also going to talk about what to do when you get sick, and of course, talk about the adjustments made the last couple of weeks. Hey, this is Colin DeWay. If you are new here and want to create long-term sustainable results, make sure you subscribe today and click on that bell notification so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned last week, we're going to be doing alternating weeks now between the Reverse Diet series that I'm doing today and then my own personal cut series that I did last week and we'll do again next week. So today is the last 2 weeks of Vivian's Reverse. But before I get into actual numbers, I'm going to talk a little bit about creating an actual schedule for things like reverse diets and potentially cuts and how that can benefit you. And the reason I'm doing this is because this is something that Vivian and I discussed last week. And at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about what to do when you get sick, because this is something that happened to Vivian last week. So yeah, Vivian and I had a really good conversation about what we wanted to do with her long-term plans. Part of it was related to her powerlifting goals because we're talking about getting her back on the platform one day. And the other part is what to do with her reverse and her building phase and how long we actually want to do things. And the reason I think it's a really good idea to schedule out reverses or building phases when you can is because it can really help with adherence. Same thing goes for a cut. If you go into a cut or a reverse with a completely unknown plan and you're just kind of winging it and seeing what happens, a lot of times it can make it difficult to stick to the plan because it feels like there's never going to be an end to it. So if you have an end date in sight, sometimes that can really help with kind of creating a sense of urgency and also keeping you focused, knowing that, hey, this is going to be done at some point. I just need to focus on what I'm doing until that date comes up. However, this won't always be possible. It kind of depends on your starting position and where you're at metabolically and how much we know about your dieting history and things like that. See, if you're someone who has an extremely long history of dieting, tons of yo-yo dieting, a lot of extreme dieting, and you're just in a really bad way, we can't always predict that we're going to be able to be done with a reverse at a certain point. So sometimes we have to just see how things go, and we can't really create a plan until we can see how the body starts to respond and get a better idea of how things are going to go. Because unfortunately, in the earlier stages, especially if there's been a lot of ups and downs in your life, we just never really know how somebody is going to respond, and we don't want to make plans if we're not going to be able to keep them. But that doesn't mean we can't make some tentative plans. So we can always say, okay, like let's plan on reverse dieting for the next 6 months. We'll get to the end of 6 months and we'll readdress from there. So it can still help to have kind of an end date, even though it's not necessarily set in stone. At least you have some sort of an idea, just understanding that, hey, down the road, we may have to extend it depending on how things have gone. Now in Vivian's case, since we're going into a building phase and she actually wants to focus on building muscle on top of improving her metabolism. So we're going to keep this process going and going to do it until at least the end of the year. And I actually really like this strategy. So it gives us plenty of time. She's going to be out of a deficit for a really long time by then. She won't have to worry about dieting through the holidays or anything like that. We can just focus on this, focus on building, and we can actually show you what happens and how somebody can go through a building phase and gain weight, and it can be more relevant. Because I get it, right now, it's not always the most relevant thing. Seeing somebody continually lose weight and maintain their weight while increasing calories like crazy, that's not always going to be how the process goes for everybody. So I think it'll be beneficial both for her and for you to see her gaining weight over the rest of this year. And then as we get closer to the end of the year, we'll start discussing, hey, what do we want to do for our cutting plans? When does it make sense? And also, when do you want to do a meet? And we'll have to put everything together and just make sure everything makes sense with her life at that time. Now, as far as how things went for the last 2 weeks for Vivian, for week 21, which was 2 weeks ago, she was pretty tired and sore and feeling pretty run down. And honestly, I wasn't surprised by this. I was expecting it. I've actually been trying to get her to this position. She is at the end of a training block. I was pushing her a little bit harder than usual. And the reason for this was I wanted to see what her deadlifts would look like when they got to be a little bit more of a grind. Now, one thing you do have to remember when it comes to being really sore is that means that you're going to have some training inflammation. And if you have more inflammation, oftentimes that will show up on the scale. So as I've talked about many times, we can't just look at scale weight and always just think, well, whatever changes there are, it's all body fat. That's not how it goes. There are a lot of different factors that go into scale weight. But with that being said, she actually was pretty stable from the week before. She actually only gained about 0.14 pounds on average from week to week. So because she was pretty stable and she was pretty tired and sore, and at the end of a training block, I decided to go ahead and give her another bump in calories. So I gave her another 5 grams of carbs and 2 grams of fat. Again, because she's actually in a building phase now, I wanted to make sure that she has enough calories to keep up with the demand. Unfortunately for Vivian though, right after we had this check-in, she actually got really sick. So this kind of knocked her out of commission for a while, and we had to talk about what we wanted to do for training, and also you always have to think about nutrition can be a little bit more difficult when it comes to being sick. So I figured this was a good opportunity to talk about what to do when you do get sick yourself. So I personally believe a lot of it depends on how sick you are and what your goals are and what you really want out of your training. So if you're someone who's really serious about your training and your goals and you have big expectations, you might have to dig a little deeper than other people, but that doesn't mean that we should always go no matter what. So my general rule of thumb is if you have a fever, you need to stay in bed and stay out of the gym. Not only to make sure that you recover properly, but not to get anybody else sick as well. However, if we're just talking about having a little bit of a cold, just having the sniffles and just feeling a little bit tired, but you don't have a fever, this is when I personally think if you have big goals, it's grind time and you still need to get after it. Because let's be honest, anybody can do work when they feel good. Champions are made by doing work when other people wouldn't. But hey, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about how everyone needs to be hardcore. For some people, it just isn't that big of a deal. If this is just a regular lifestyle kind of thing, sometimes it makes sense to back off and that's okay. What we want to do is make sure we don't get into the all or nothing approach and feel like, well, just because I'm not on it, then there's no point and I might as well binge my face off. And another thing to keep in mind is oftentimes it's hard to get back in the game, right? So objects in motion tend to stay in motion, objects at rest stay at rest, right? Same thing goes for people. Once you get out of the game for a while, oftentimes the hardest part is just getting going again. So there could be some real benefit of just getting in there and getting something done if you feel good enough to at least go. But if you're really sick and just dying, and especially if you have a fever, you got to make sure you stay home and recover. So because Vivian was really sick last week, she needed to take a handful of days and just focus on recovery, which I was all for. And really, since we were going into a deload, the timing actually worked out pretty well. Now, as far as nutrition goes, if you're really sick, obviously it can be really hard to eat a lot of food, and it can be especially hard to eat protein. So in this circumstance, I typically just say, hey, just get calories in however you can, whatever source you can, as long as you can get something in. Because most of the time, this isn't going to be one of those times where you're going to overeat like crazy. Typically, it's tougher to eat when you feel sick. So it's just about getting something that will settle with your stomach, get some calories in, usually some easy to eat carbs, and just do your best to get the calories in the best you can. So with her not feeling the best, the calories were a little bit low, but it was actually okay. She wasn't too far under anyway. And often I recommend lowering your carbs by about 10%, or possibly even carbs and fats by 10% when you're not going to be training when you normally would. So anyway, she's getting back into training now. We're just going to hold steady with the calories since things were off last week. Weight's up a little bit, but that tends to happen anyways just from being sick and having some extra inflammation. So it's just about getting back into things now. So we pushed back her intro week to her training block, and she'll start that this week and just kind of get back into the groove again as she starts to feel better. One thing you don't want to do is get back into training too hard too fast when you've been really sick, because then you're going to impede your recovery process and it's just going to put you that much more behind. So this week she just kind of went in, chased a light pump, didn't really have any specific plan, and just got in there and did a little bit of work when she started feeling up to it. And now this week we'll get back into actual programming again. So I want to hear from you. What do you typically do when you're sick? Do you have any kind of general rules of thumbs that you use? Do you typically go in and grind it? Do you take time to recover? I'm just curious to hear what you personally do. And if you missed my personal update last week as I start my cut, make sure you check out that video next, which I'll have up here in the corner, and I'll see you guys next time.